Good evening and welcome, sweet viewer. Please try to find a quiet moment. Let the noise and the light of your world recede and prepare to journey back with me into a landscape of stark deserts and even starker faith. If these explorations into the deep, often dark, heart of ancient stories help you to find a quiet space in your own mind, consider subscribing, as it will help us continue these sleepy journeys together, filled with wondrous dreams. A journey into the past may be the best way to find a peaceful night's sleep in the present. Tonight we approach a story that is so foundational, so elemental to three of the world's great religions, that it has been polished by centuries of reverence into a smooth and shining parable of faith. But we are going to look beneath the polish. We are going to feel the rough, sharp edges of the original tale. This is the story of a father, a son, a mountain, and a knife. But before we can climb that mountain, before we can face the terror that waits at its summit, we must first understand the almost unbearable preciousness of the boy. To comprehend the horror of what Abraham was asked to do, we must first comprehend the magnificent, impossible, and world-defining miracle that was his son, Isaac. The story of Abraham begins not with a child, but with the devastating absence of one. He enters the biblical narrative as Abram, a man from the sophisticated Mesopotamian city of Ur, a figure of considerable wealth, leading a semi-nomadic life with his wife, Sarai, and his extended family. And it is to this man, living in a world saturated with the worship of a pantheon of local and regional gods, that a new, singular, and invisible deity speaks with a voice of absolute authority. The call of this God is a command and a promise, a divine bargain that will set the course of history. God says to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." This is a promise of staggering proportions. Abram, a childless man, is promised that he will become the patriarch of a great nation. His personal legacy will become a global blessing. But the core component of this promise, the very currency of its fulfillment, is descendants. A nation is made of people, and Abram has none. The promise seems, from the very beginning, to be a paradox. God reinforces this promise with a powerful and poetic image. He takes Abram out into the clear, dark desert night, away from the flickering lights of his camp, and commands him, "Look toward heaven and number the stars. If you are able to number them, so shall your offspring be." He then uses another image, just as vast and uncountable. His descendants will be like the grains of sand on the seashore. This is the central covenant, the divine contract that will define Abraham's entire existence. He is a man who has been promised a future as vast as the cosmos, but this entire, magnificent future is contingent upon a single, simple, biological event: the birth of a legitimate heir from his own body. And for decades, that event does not happen. Abram and Sarai grow old. The promise, spoken with such divine certainty, begins to look more and more like a cruel joke against the harsh, unyielding reality of their aging bodies. The social context of their childlessness is crucial to understanding their pain. In the patriarchal, tribal culture of the ancient Near East, a man's wealth and status were measured in livestock and sons. Sons were the labor force, the warriors, the guarantors of the family line, the ones who would carry on the father's name and legacy. A man without sons was a man without a future, a dead end. For a woman, the shame of barrenness was even more acute. A woman's primary value was in her fertility. A barren wife was seen as a failure, a source of profound personal grief and public disgrace, often interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure. The years stretch into decades. Abram becomes a mighty chieftain, a man of immense wealth and military prowess, but the central promise remains mockingly unfulfilled. The silence from the divine on this one crucial matter becomes a source of deep human anxiety. Finally, Sarai, in an act of desperate, pragmatic faith, takes matters into her own hands. She offers a solution that was a common and legally recognized practice in their culture: She gives her Egyptian handmaiden, Hagar, to her husband so that he might produce an heir through her. It may be, she says with a heartbreaking resignation, that I shall obtain children by her. This plan, born of human desperation to help the divine promise along, is a disaster from the start. It introduces jealousy, resentment, and cruelty into the heart of Abraham's family. Hagar, upon conceiving, looks upon her barren mistress with contempt. Sarai, in a fit of jealous rage, deals with Hagar so harshly that the pregnant slave flees into the wilderness. Even after Hagar is persuaded by an angel to return and gives birth to a son, Ishmael, the boy is not the true heir of the promise. God makes this explicitly clear to Abraham. Ishmael is blessed. He will become the father of a great nation of his own, but he is not the one. The covenant will be established through a son born of Sarah. This divine insistence on Sarah as the mother is a crucial part of the story. The promise is not just to be fulfilled, but to be fulfilled in a way that is biologically and naturally impossible, so that there can be no doubt as to its divine origin. More years pass. Abraham is now 99 years old. Sarah is 90. They are, by any natural standard, long past the age of childbearing. Their bodies are, as the New Testament would later put it, as good as dead. It is at this moment of absolute human impossibility that God appears to Abraham again and makes the promise explicit and immediate. He changes their names from Abram, exalted father, to Abraham, father of a multitude, and from Sarai, my princess, to Sarah, princess to all. He declares, I will bless her, and she shall become nations, kings of peoples shall come from her. And then, the punchline, Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. Abraham's reaction is not one of solemn, pious acceptance. It is one of stunned, incredulous laughter. The text says, Abraham fell on his face and laughed. It is the laugh of a man who has heard the most absurd thing in the world. He is 100 years old. His wife is 90. The idea is a biological absurdity. He even tries to offer God a more realistic alternative. Oh, that Ishmael might live before you. He is, in essence, asking God to accept the son he already has, the son born of human effort and natural means. But God is insistent. The miracle is the point. No, he says, but Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son. When Sarah herself, eavesdropping from the entrance of their tent, hears the same prophecy from a divine messenger, she too laughs to herself. It is the weary, cynical laugh of a woman whose body and whose hopes have long since withered. But the divine promise overrides the laws of nature. A year later, exactly as prophesied, the impossible happens. Sarah conceives and gives birth to a son. They name him Isaac, Yitzhak in Hebrew, a name derived from the word for laughter. His very name is a permanent reminder of his parents' initial, skeptical laughter, a testament to the fact that God's power is made perfect in human impossibility. The birth of Isaac is the single most important event in Abraham's long life. It is the culmination of a century of waiting, the answer to a lifetime of prayer, the silencing of a lifetime of shame. But Isaac is so much more than just a beloved, long-awaited child. He is the living, breathing, tangible proof of the covenant. Every time Abraham looks at his son, he is not just seeing a child. He is seeing the physical embodiment of God's faithfulness. He is seeing the promise of the stars and the sand made flesh. Isaac is the single, fragile linchpin upon which the entire divine plan for the future of the world now rests. If anything happens to this one specific boy, the entire covenant collapses. The promise of a great nation, the promise of a blessing to all the families of the earth, all of it is channeled through the life of this single, miraculous child. The weight of the world, in a very real sense, rests on his small shoulders. The preciousness of Isaac is further amplified by the next great crisis in the family, the expulsion of Hagar and Ishmael. Sarah, seeing the young teenager Ishmael mocking her own toddler, Isaac, is filled with a fierce, protective jealousy. She sees Ishmael not just as a rival for affection, but as a threat to Isaac's inheritance. She demands that Abraham cast them out. Cast out this slave woman with her son, she commands. For the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. The thought is deeply distressing to Abraham, for Ishmael is still his son. But God himself intervenes and sides with Sarah. He tells Abraham to do as his wife says, reassuring him that Ishmael will be cared for, but making the line of inheritance brutally clear. For through Isaac shall your offspring be named. The resulting scene is one of the most heartbreaking in all of Genesis. Abraham rises early, gives Hagar some bread and a skin of water, and sends her and his firstborn son away into the wilderness of Beersheba to fend for themselves. This act of familial cruelty, commanded by God, serves a crucial narrative purpose. It removes any ambiguity. It eliminates any backup plan. Ishmael is gone. Isaac is now not just the promised son, he is the only son, the sole heir, the single, irreplaceable vessel of the covenant. The value of his life has become, in a theological sense, infinite. This is the man and this is the son that we find at the beginning of Genesis chapter 22. Abraham is now an old man, perhaps 120 or 130 years old. Isaac is a youth, a young man on the cusp of adulthood. The years of waiting are a distant memory. The family drama with Hagar and Ishmael is in the past. Abraham's life has finally settled into a state of peaceful, blessed fulfillment. He has his miracle child, the living proof of his covenant with God. He can look at his son, the son of his old age, the son born of laughter and impossibility, and see in his face the future of a great nation, the fulfillment of a promise as vast as the starry sky. His faith has been tested by decades of waiting, and it has been spectacularly rewarded. He is a man who has received the one thing he wanted most in the entire world, and he has received it directly from the hand of God. It is a state of perfect, peaceful, and blessed completion. It is the happiest Abraham has ever been. And it is into this perfect, quiet happiness that the voice of God will come one last time, with a command so monstrous, so insane, and so utterly contradictory to everything that has come before, that it will threaten to not only destroy Abraham's life, but to shatter the very meaning of faith itself. The stage has been meticulously set to maximize the horror. The value of the sacrifice has been raised to an unbearable, infinite degree. The knife, when it comes, will not just be aimed at a child. It will be aimed at the very heart of the promise, the very heart of hope, the very heart of God's own faithfulness. The years of peace in the land of the Philistines, in the dusty plains around Beersheba, had been a long, golden autumn for the patriarch Abraham. The decades of desperate wandering, of famine and war, of shame and waiting were over. The central, agonizing question of his life, the question of an heir, had been answered in the most spectacular and miraculous fashion. The laughter of his young son, Isaac, was a constant, living music in his camp, a daily affirmation of God's faithfulness. The covenant, once an abstract promise whispered on a starry night, now had a face, a voice, a physical presence. Isaac was not just the son of his old age, he was the walking, breathing embodiment of the divine plan. In him, and through him, Abraham could see the future taking shape, the great nation, the blessing to all the families of the earth. He was a man at peace, his life's great purpose secured, his relationship with his God seemingly settled into one of mutual trust and fulfillment. It is into this profound and well-earned tranquility that the narrative of Genesis 22 inserts a phrase of almost unbearable, ominous power. After these things, God tested Abraham. After these things. The phrase is a deliberate and cruel narrative device. It is precisely because of these things, because of the century of waiting, because of the miracle of Isaac's birth, because of the expulsion of Ishmael which had made Isaac the sole and irreplaceable heir, because of the years of peaceful joy, that the test to come will be so monstrously, infinitely cruel. The story has spent 21 chapters meticulously, painstakingly building the value of Isaac to an almost unbearable degree. Now, in a single sentence, it signals its intention to place that entire, infinitely precious creation on the sacrificial block. And the nature of this event is defined from the outset. It is a test, nissa in Hebrew. The word implies a trial, a proving, a demonstration. But a test of what, precisely? The traditional, reassuring interpretation is that this is a test of Abraham's faith and obedience, a final, ultimate examination to prove his loyalty to God. But as the story unfolds, it becomes clear that this is a test of a far darker and more terrifying nature. It is a test of the absolute limits of human devotion. It is a test to see if a man's love for God can be made to be greater than his love for his own child, greater than his own reason, greater than his own moral compass, greater than the very promises God himself has made. It is a test to find the breaking point of the human soul, to see how much weight of divine contradiction a single human heart can bear before it shatters. The divine voice that now speaks to Abraham in the dead of night is not the voice of the promising, covenant-making God of the previous chapters. It is a different voice, one that is cold, precise, and terrifyingly intimate in its cruelty. The command is not delivered as a vague, abstract instruction. It is a masterpiece of psychological torture, each word a turn of the screw, a deliberate and specific twisting of the knife that is already aimed at Abraham's heart. He said, "Abraham," and he said, "Here I am." This is the standard, obedient response of the prophet, the immediate and unquestioning readiness of the servant before his master. It is the last moment of normalcy, the last time Abraham's "Here I am" will be a simple statement of presence. From this moment on, his very being will be defined by the command that follows. God says, "Take your son." The command begins with this simple, brutal imperative. But it does not stop there. The voice seems to savor the cruelty, adding a series of appositives, each one designed to amplify the horror and leave absolutely no room for misunderstanding or evasion. "Your only son." This phrase is a direct, calculated blow. Isaac is not his only biological son. Ishmael still lives in the wilderness. But in the context of the covenant, in the context of God's own explicit decree, he is the only one who matters. God here is reminding Abraham of the very act of painful separation he himself had commanded. The casting out of Ishmael, the act that had placed the entire weight of the future on this one boy. He is reminding Abraham that there is no backup, no replacement. This is the one, Isaac. The naming of the child is the next turn of the screw. This is not an abstract son. This is Isaac, Yitzhak, the child of laughter, the child whose very name is a monument to the joyous absurdity of his own miraculous birth. The command is to sacrifice not just the heir, but to sacrifice the laughter itself, to extinguish the joy that had defined Abraham's old age. Whom you love. This is the final and most terrible clause, the most intimate and sadistic twist of the knife. God, who is supposed to be omniscient, here states a fact as if to confirm it, forcing Abraham to confront the emotional reality of what is being asked. This is not a legal transaction or a theological abstraction. This is an affair of the heart. The command is to take the person who is the object of his deepest and most profound human love and to personally, willfully destroy him. The test is a direct, frontal assault on the most powerful and sacred of human bonds, the love of a parent for a child. God is, in essence, setting himself up in a direct competition with Isaac for Abraham's ultimate love and loyalty. And he is demanding that Abraham prove his love for God by the violent negation of his love for his son. The full command is a single, breathtakingly monstrous sentence. Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Let us dissect the final part of this instruction. Go to the land of Moriah. The journey is not to be a short one. Moriah, traditionally identified with the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, is a 3-day walk from Beersheba. This is not a crime of passion to be committed in a moment of hot-blooded religious frenzy. This is to be a slow, deliberate, premeditated act. Abraham is being given time, 3 long days, to think about what he is about to do, to live with the horror of his commission, to let the reality of it sink into the very marrow of his bones. The journey itself is an integral part of the torture, and what he is to do there is specified with a chilling ritualistic precision. He is to offer him there as a burnt offering, olah in Hebrew. A burnt offering was the most complete and total form of sacrifice in the ancient world. An animal was not just killed, Its body was completely consumed by fire on an altar, its substance transformed into smoke that would rise to the heavens as a pleasing aroma to the deity. It was an act of total surrender, of giving something over to the divine in the most absolute way possible. To offer Isaac as a burnt offering meant that Abraham was not just to kill his son, he was to bind him, to slit his throat like a lamb, to drain his blood, to dismember his body, and to place the pieces on a pyre and watch them burn until nothing was left but ash and memory. This was not to be a simple murder. It was to be an act of ritualized, sacred butchery. The most terrifying aspect of this command lies in its profound and absolute contradiction of everything Abraham knew about God. This command was, in essence, a command for God to commit suicide. The entire identity of the God of Abraham was built upon the foundation of the covenant, the promise. Isaac was the sole, irreplaceable vessel of that promise. To command Abraham to kill Isaac was to command him to kill the covenant itself. It was an act of divine self-negation. The God of the promise was now demanding the destruction of the promise. The God of the future was now demanding the annihilation of the future. The God who had condemned the Canaanites for their practice of child sacrifice was now demanding the very same abomination from his most faithful servant. The command is, from a human perspective, the command of a mad God, a deity who is either insane, monstrously evil, or playing a game whose rules are so far beyond human comprehension as to be indistinguishable from madness. It shatters every category of reason, morality, and theological consistency. It is a command that is, on its face, absurd. Abraham has every possible reason to refuse, to question, to argue. He has a precedent for doing so. Years before, in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, when God had announced his intention to destroy the wicked cities, Abraham had famously challenged him. He had haggled with God, arguing on the basis of divine justice and mercy. "Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just?" he had demanded, a question of breathtaking audacity. He had argued God down from 50 righteous men to 10 in an attempt to save the city. He had shown himself to be a man who was not afraid to question God, to hold God accountable to his own stated principles of justice. But now, when the life of his own beloved son is at stake, when the command is infinitely more personal and infinitely more monstrous, Abraham is silent. This is the great, terrifying, and profound silence of Genesis 22. He does not argue. He does not protest. He does not ask why. He does not fall to his face and plead for his son's life. The text offers us no access to his internal state, no hint of his emotional turmoil. It simply records his actions, actions of a swift and chillingly methodical obedience. The man who had been a lawyer for the people of Sodom now becomes a silent, obedient executioner for his own son. Why this silence? What has changed? This question has haunted philosophers and theologians for centuries. Perhaps his earlier argument over Sodom, which had ultimately failed to save the city, had taught him the futility of questioning a divine decree. Perhaps his faith had evolved to a point where he no longer saw God as a partner in a contract to be negotiated, but as an absolute sovereign whose will was beyond all human questioning. The Danish existentialist philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, in his masterpiece Fear and Trembling, would later argue that Abraham's silence is the very essence of his faith. Abraham, Kierkegaard argues, has taken a leap of faith into a realm that is beyond human ethics, beyond reason. He is performing a teleological suspension of the ethical. He is suspending all his human moral understanding for the sake of a higher, divine purpose that he cannot possibly comprehend. He is acting not on reason, but on a raw, direct, personal command from God, a command that isolates him from all universal moral laws. In this reading, Abraham's silence is the silence of a man who has been utterly and completely alone with his God, in a relationship so absolute that it transcends all other duties, including the duty of a father to protect his son. Another interpretation might be more psychological. The command is so traumatic, so utterly world-shattering that it induces a state of shock, a kind of psychological numbness. Abraham's silence is the silence of a man whose mind has been short-circuited by a horror it cannot process. His obedience is not the product of a superhuman faith, but of a profound and deeply human trauma. He simply does what he is told, moving like an automaton, because the alternative, To actually think about and feel the reality of the command is to descend into a madness from which he might never return. His silence is the sound of a mind trying desperately to hold itself together in the face of the unthinkable. Whatever the reason, the effect of his silence is profound. It focuses the entire horror of the story on the raw, unexplained nature of the command and the chillingly stoic nature of the response. There is no theological debate to soften the blow, no emotional outburst to make Abraham more relatable. There is only the terrible, cold command and the equally terrible, silent obedience. The voice in the night has spoken, and in doing so, it has seemingly erased the past and nullified the future. It has plunged Abraham into a moral and spiritual void, a place where love must be expressed as violence and faith must be demonstrated through an act of ritual murder. He is now a man with a secret, a purpose, and a destination. The only thing that is left is the long, silent walk towards the mountain. The voice had fallen silent, leaving behind it a stillness more terrifying than any thunder. The command had been given, a divine decree that had ripped a hole in the fabric of reality, leaving Abraham standing on the precipice of a moral and spiritual abyss. The night that followed must have been a sleepless one, a long, dark eternity spent wrestling with the monstrous, incomprehensible instruction. The biblical text, with its characteristic and chilling economy of language, offers us no insight into the patriarch's inner turmoil. It does not speak of tears, of prayers for deliverance, of a tormented soul crying out in the darkness. It simply records the chillingly mundane and methodical actions that followed the sunrise. The horror of the story is amplified by this very lack of emotional description, forcing us to imagine the raging storm of grief and confusion that must have been hidden behind the mask of stoic obedience. So Abraham rose early in the morning. This is the first action, and it is devastating in its simplicity. He did not delay. He did not procrastinate, hoping for a second, clarifying vision. He did not linger in his tent, hoping the command was merely a terrible nightmare from which he might yet awaken. He rose early, at the very first hint of dawn, as if driven by a grim internal urgency. It is the action of a man who knows that any hesitation, any moment of quiet reflection might cause his terrible resolve to crumble. He must move, he must act, he must transform the unthinkable from a nocturnal horror into a series of concrete physical tasks, lest his own heart and his own reason rise up in rebellion and stop him. His obedience is a form of motion, a defense mechanism against the paralysis of thought. The preparations that follow are a litany of the mundane made monstrous by the unspoken purpose behind them. He saddled his donkey, a simple, daily chore for a nomadic chieftain, yet on this morning it is the act of preparing the transport for a funeral procession of one. He took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. He assembles the cast for his terrible drama. The 2 young men are witnesses, but only up to a point. They are part of the journey, but they will not be privy to its final, terrible destination. And he takes Isaac. The text presents it so simply, yet the act of waking his son that morning, of looking into the face of the boy he was commanded to kill, must have been an act of almost superhuman, or perhaps inhuman, self-control. Did his voice tremble as he called his name? Did he avoid his son's gaze? And then, the most terrible preparation of all, and he cut the wood for the burnt offering. This is an act of profound and horrifying intimacy. He is not just preparing for a generic sacrifice, he is personally preparing the fuel that will consume the body of his own child. Every swing of the axe, every splinter of wood that flew, was a physical participation in the act of filicide. The neat pile of wood he assembled was not just fuel, it was the raw material of his son's cremation. The methodical physical labor of splitting the wood can be seen as another psychological defense, a way to channel his grief and terror into a tangible, exhausting task. But it is also an act of horrifying commitment. With every piece of wood he cut, he was building the physical reality of the sacrifice, making it more and more difficult to turn back. And he rose up and went to the place of which God had told him. The journey begins. A small, sad caravan sets out from the familiar landscape of Beersheba and heads north towards the distant, unknown mountains of Moriah. The journey, the text tells us, will last for 3 days. This detail is not incidental. It is a crucial element of the psychological torture of the test. As we have seen, this is not to be a crime of passion, a sudden, frenzied act of religious ecstasy. This is a slow, cold, and deliberate march towards a premeditated killing. The 3 days provide a temporal space for the full weight and horror of the command to settle upon Abraham's soul. It is a journey into a void, a 3-day walk into nothingness, a period of suspended animation between the command and its execution. Let us try to imagine the quality of this journey. The landscape of the Negev and the Judean hills through which they traveled would have been stark and beautiful. Rocky terrain, sparse vegetation, a vast and empty sky. But Abraham would not have seen it. His entire world would have been compressed into the terrible secret he carried in his heart. The primary quality of this journey, the defining feature of these 3 days, must have been silence. What could Abraham possibly say? How could he engage in the normal, everyday chatter of a father traveling with his son? Every ordinary question from Isaac, "Father, what is that bird? Father, are we almost there?" would have been a dagger in Abraham's heart. Every loving, innocent glance from the boy would have been a fresh accusation. To speak would be to lie, to pretend that this was a normal journey, a normal act of worship. And so, it is likely that he retreated into a profound, almost catatonic silence, a silence that was both a shield for his own sanity and a terrifying mystery to his companions. The 2 young servants traveling with them would have sensed the grim, oppressive atmosphere. They would have seen the stony, unreadable expression on their master's face. They would have noted his unusual quietness. But they would not have known the reason. They were outside the circle of the terrible secret, their presence a reminder of a normal world that Abraham was in the process of leaving behind forever. And what of Isaac? The boy is not a passive object in this story. He is a character, a participant. He is old enough to ask questions, to carry wood, to understand the mechanics of a sacrifice. Jewish tradition often portrays him not as a small child, but as a young man, perhaps even in his late teens or 20s, making the story even more psychologically complex. But for now, on the journey, he is simply a son traveling with his father. He would have been filled with the normal curiosity and perhaps excitement of a journey to a distant, holy place for a great act of worship. But the silence of his father, the grim, focused energy, the lack of any normal paternal warmth, must have been deeply unsettling. He would have sensed that this was no ordinary pilgrimage. A cloud of unspoken dread would have hung over their small caravan, a dread that the boy could feel but could not yet name. The days would have been filled with the simple, rhythmic act of walking, a mindless forward motion that prevented thought. But the nights would have been the true test. Imagine the scene as they made camp at the end of the first day. A small fire crackles. The servants are asleep. Abraham and Isaac lie under the stars, the very same stars that God had once used as a metaphor for the boy's own innumerable descendants. Now that promise seemed like a distant, mocking dream. In the quiet of the desert night, with his son sleeping peacefully beside him, the full weight of the command would have returned to Abraham. This is where the true battle must have been waged, not on the mountain, but in the silent darkness of his own mind during these 2 nights of the journey. Here, he would have had to confront the sheer, maddening irrationality of his mission. His reason would have screamed at him, "This is insane. The God of promise does not demand the destruction of the promise. This must be a trick, a demonic illusion, a test from a malevolent spirit, not from the true God." His heart would have screamed at him, "This is your son, the child you waited a century for, the child of your beloved Sarah. To kill him is to kill yourself, to kill your wife, to kill your own soul." Every fiber of his being, every rational thought, every paternal instinct, every moral principle he had ever held would have been at war with the memory of that single terrible voice in the night. How did he overcome this internal rebellion? What force was powerful enough to silence the screams of his own reason and his own heart? The text gives us only one answer: faith. But the faith required here is of a terrifying and almost alien kind. It is not a comforting, reasonable faith. It is a faith that is defined by its ability to believe in 2 mutually exclusive and contradictory ideas at the same time. It is the faith that God has promised to make Isaac the father of a great nation, and the faith that God has now commanded him to kill Isaac before he can have any children. To hold both of these ideas in the mind at once, without collapsing into madness, is the essence of what Kierkegaard would call the movement of the absurd. Abraham, in the silence of the night, must have been performing this movement. He had to believe, on some level, that God, in his infinite power, could and would somehow resolve this impossible contradiction. He had to believe that even if he went through with the act, even if he plunged the knife into his son's heart and burned his body to ash, God could still fulfill his promise. Perhaps he remembered the promise that his descendants would be like the dust of the earth, and believed that God could reassemble Isaac from the dust and ash of the altar. Perhaps he held on to a faith so radical, so beyond all logic, that it was a form of holy madness. This is the faith of a man who is willing to walk into a paradox, to trust in a God who has just proven himself to be utterly and terrifyingly untrustworthy. And so he would rise on the second day and the third and continue his silent, methodical walk. The journey was a physical manifestation of this internal struggle. It was a long, slow process of killing his own reason, his own morality, his own love, in order to make room for a single, naked, and terrifying act of obedience. He was emptying himself of everything that made him human, so that he could become a perfect, unthinking instrument of the divine will. On the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. This is the moment of crisis, the point of no return. The third day, in biblical narrative, is often a day of climax and resolution. It was on the third day that Jonah was released from the belly of the whale. It was on the third day that Jesus would rise from the dead. For Abraham, the third day is the day the abstract horror becomes an imminent physical reality. He sees the mountain. His terrible destination is no longer a distant concept. It is a geographical fact. It is there. It is waiting for him. The sight of the mountain must have been like a physical blow. The time for walking and not thinking was over. The time for acting was at hand. It is at this moment that he performs another crucial act, the separation of the sacred from the profane, the secret from the known. He turns to his 2 young servants and says, "Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." This statement is a masterpiece of chilling ambiguity. On one level, it is a simple deception, a lie to placate the servants and prevent them from interfering with the terrible business to come. But on another, deeper level, it can be read as a statement of Abraham's own mad, absurd faith. We will go and come again to you. The pronoun is plural, we. Is he expressing a desperate, irrational hope that God will provide a miracle, that both he and his son will somehow return from the mountain unscathed? Is it a slip of the tongue, a moment where his fatherly heart overrides his conscious knowledge? Or is it the ultimate expression of his faith, a calm, prophetic statement that he knows, on some level beyond reason, that the contradiction will be resolved and the boy will be saved? The text leaves us in this state of unbearable tension. We do not know if he is a liar, a madman, or a prophet. We only know that he is walking up the mountain. The final stage of this journey is the most intimate and the most heartbreaking. Abraham has separated himself from the world of ordinary men. It is now just him and his son walking together into the place of sacrifice. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac, his son. This single physical act is a moment of almost unbearable symbolic weight. The boy, the intended victim, is now forced to become an active participant in his own execution. He is made to carry the very fuel that will be used to consume his own body. It is a haunting prefiguration of the Christian narrative of Christ carrying his own cross to Golgotha. Isaac, like the ram that will soon replace him, is being led to his own slaughter, and he is carrying the wood for the fire himself. They walk on, both of them together, a phrase that emphasizes their unity, a unity that is about to be shattered in the most violent way imaginable. The silence that has defined their journey is finally broken, not by the father, but by the son. It is a moment that is so simple, so innocent, and so devastating that it has stood for millennia as one of the most powerful and heartbreaking moments in all of literature. The boy speaks, and with a few simple words he slices through his father's stony resolve and exposes the raw emotional horror of their situation. The 3-day walk into nothingness is over. They have arrived at the foot of the mountain, and the time for the terrible dialogue has begun. The world had shrunk to the size of a single, lonely mountain path. The two servants, representatives of the mundane, predictable world, had been left behind at the foot of the hill, their understanding extending only to the boundary of this strange, sacred, and terrible space. Abraham had crossed a threshold, leaving the world of human logic and companionship behind and stepping into a solitary landscape where the only other inhabitant was his God and his son. The journey was no longer measured in days, but in footsteps. Each step up the rocky slope of Mount Moriah was a step closer to the consummation of the unthinkable, a step deeper into the heart of the divine paradox. The universe, which God had once promised would be filled with this boy's descendants, was now compressed into this narrow, ascending path, a path that led not to a future of multitudes, but to a stone altar and a waiting knife. And it is on this final, terrible ascent that the silence that has shrouded the journey is finally, devastatingly broken. The text presents the scene with a stark, minimalist power that amplifies its emotional weight. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife, so they went, both of them together. Every detail in this short passage is laden with a horrifying significance. The transfer of the wood is a moment of profound and cruel irony. The father, the architect of the sacrifice, places the instrument of cremation onto the back of his own beloved son. Isaac, the boy of promise, is transformed into a beast of burden, carrying the fuel for his own immolation. He is an unwitting accomplice in his own death march. The image is one of a terrible, inverted piety. The son, in his dutiful obedience to his father, carries the very object that will be used to erase his own future. And Abraham, the text tells us, carries the fire and the knife. These are the two essential tools of the ritual executioner. The fire, likely a small brazier of hot coals, represents the divine element, the consuming, purifying flame that will transform the offering into smoke and ash, a message to the heavens. The knife, in Hebrew, the ma'akelet, a word specifically used for a large butchering or sacrificial knife, represents the human element, the cold, sharp, and decisive act of killing. The father carries the instruments of death, while the son carries the fuel for the pyre. They are a self-contained sacrificial unit, a complete and terrible ecosystem of death, moving slowly up the mountainside. The phrase that concludes this tableau, "So they went, both of them together," is almost unbearable in its simple, poignant tragedy. It emphasizes their physical proximity, their shared journey, at the very moment their internal realities are separated by an infinite chasm of knowledge and intent. They are together, yet they have never been further apart. It is into this tableau of terrible, silent purpose that Isaac's voice emerges, a sound of pure, innocent, and devastating logic. The boy has been observing the preparations. He is not a small child. He understands the mechanics of worship, the necessary components for a burnt offering. He has seen his father perform this ritual many times before. He sees the wood, he sees the fire, he sees the knife, and he notices that a crucial element is missing. The silence is broken by his small, questioning voice. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, "My father." The address is one of respect and intimacy. It is the simple, trusting call of a son to the man who is his entire world, his protector, his source of life and knowledge. The sound of this address, "Avi, my father," must have been a blow to Abraham's heart more powerful than any physical assault. It is a reminder of the very relationship he is about to betray, the sacred bond he is about to sever with a knife. Abraham's response is immediate and strained. "Here I am, my son." The same phrase he had used to answer the call of God, "Here I am," he now uses to answer the call of his son. But the meaning is horribly inverted. To God, it was a statement of absolute, unconditional availability for service. To Isaac, it is a lie, a mask of paternal presence that conceals a terrible, hidden purpose. He is there, physically, but his heart and his will are aligned with a command that negates every duty that the title, "My Father," implies. Isaac then asks his simple, logical, and soul-shattering question. He said, "Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" This is the central, ethical, and emotional pivot of the entire narrative. It is the moment the story's unbearable tension becomes explicit. It is the voice of human reason in the face of divine madness. It is the innocent logic of a child colliding with the terrible, incomprehensible faith of the father. Isaac is not being rebellious or suspicious. He is simply an observant participant in a religious ritual, pointing out a logistical oversight. He knows the checklist for a sacrifice: altar, wood, fire, knife, and victim. He sees the first four, but the fifth, the most crucial element, is missing. His question is born of a pure and simple piety. He wants the sacrifice to be done correctly. He has no idea that in asking for the lamb, he is, in fact, asking for himself. The question, "Where is the lamb?" hangs in the air between them, a question that is both profoundly simple and infinitely complex. It is a practical question about a missing animal, but it is also a profound theological question. It is the cry of humanity throughout the ages in the face of suffering. If God is good, where is the sacrifice that will make this right? It is the question of a world that is filled with the instruments of suffering, the fire and the wood, but seems to be missing the element of redemption, the lamb. Abraham is now trapped. The silence that has been his shield for 3 days is no longer an option. He must answer his son. He cannot tell him the truth, for that would be a cruelty beyond measure, to force the boy to live with the terror of his own impending murder for the final steps of the journey. But he cannot simply lie and say, "I forgot it," for that would undermine the entire solemn purpose of their pilgrimage. His response is one of the most famous, most debated, and most chillingly ambiguous sentences in all of literature. Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." What does this sentence mean? It is a statement of such profound and layered depth that it can be read in multiple contradictory ways, and its true meaning is likely found in the shimmering, unresolved tension between all of them. On one level, it is a masterpiece of evasive deception, a clever and desperate lie designed to placate the boy and preserve the terrible momentum of the journey. Abraham uses the formal, theological language of piety to deflect a direct and personal question. He shifts the agency from himself to God. He does not say, "I will find a lamb," but "God will provide one." He uses the future tense, "will provide," to push the resolution of the problem into a future moment, just beyond the immediate, uncomfortable present. The final 2 words, "my son," are a stroke of heartbreaking genius. He softens the theological abstraction with a term of intimate paternal affection, a verbal caress that is designed to reassure Isaac and silence his questions. In this reading, Abraham is a man engaged in a terrible act of gaslighting, using the language of faith to conceal the reality of his murderous intent. He is lying to his child, a lie made all the more monstrous because it is wrapped in the guise of a pious prediction. On another, deeper level, the statement can be read not as a lie, but as the ultimate expression of Abraham's own mad, absurd faith. Perhaps in this moment, Abraham is not speaking to Isaac at all. He is speaking to himself. He is speaking his own desperate, irrational hope into the empty air of the mountainside. He is clinging to the one, impossibly thin thread of hope that can get him through the next few moments. The belief that the God of the promise and the God of the command are the same God, and that this God in his infinite power will somehow resolve this impossible contradiction. He is, in essence, making a prophecy. He is declaring that a substitute will be found, that a lamb will appear, because the alternative, that God has commanded him to murder his own son for no reason, is a theological horror too great to be countenanced. In this reading, the statement is not a lie, but a desperate prayer, a declaration of faith in a miracle, at the very moment that all evidence points to a meaningless atrocity. He is gambling everything on the belief that God's love is greater than his cruelty, that the promise is more powerful than the test. A third interpretation, favored by many theological traditions, sees the statement as a moment of genuine, divinely inspired prophecy. Abraham, in this moment of supreme trial, is granted a flash of divine insight. He is speaking a truth that he himself does not fully understand. He is unwittingly predicting the arrival of the ram in the thicket. In the Christian tradition, this interpretation is taken even further. Abraham is seen as a prophet who is foretelling a much greater substitutionary sacrifice that will take place on that very same mountain range centuries later. His words, "God will provide for himself the Lamb," become a prophecy of the coming of Jesus Christ, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. In this view, Abraham's statement is not a lie nor a desperate hope, but a profound and mysterious truth, a glimpse into the heart of God's ultimate plan for salvation. The power of the narrative lies in the fact that all of these interpretations can be held in the mind at once. Abraham's words are simultaneously a cruel lie, a desperate prayer, and a sublime prophecy. He is at once a deceiver, a gambler, and a seer. He is a man pushed to the absolute limit of human endurance, and in that extremity, his words take on a diamond-hard density of meaning. After this brief, devastating exchange, the silence returns. The text tells us, with the same haunting refrain as before, "So they went, both of them together." But the quality of their togetherness has changed. Isaac's question has introduced the spectre of the victim into the open. The missing piece of the puzzle has been named. The boy may have been temporarily placated by his father's pious answer, but the question now hangs in the air between them, unanswered in any real, tangible way. They continue their walk, but now they walk in the shadow of the Lamb. The conversation is a microcosm of the entire story's horror. It pits the clear, compassionate, and logical questions of human ethics against the silent, opaque, and seemingly monstrous demands of the divine. Isaac, in his innocence, represents the human perspective. He sees the world in terms of cause and effect, of ritual propriety. His question is the question any sane, loving person would ask. Abraham represents the man of faith, a man who has been forced to step outside the bounds of that human, ethical world. His answer is not an answer. It is a deferral to a divine logic that is, from a human standpoint, indistinguishable from madness. The dialogue on the mountain is the moment where the human and the divine meet and find that they are speaking two different, mutually incomprehensible languages. One speaks of lambs and love, the other speaks of tests and obedience, and between them lies the terrifying, silent space where a father must choose which language he will ultimately honor. The final steps to the summit are taken, not in a shared understanding, but in a state of profound and tragic alienation, a father and a son walking together, but now on opposite sides of a terrible and invisible line. The dialogue was over. The terrible, ambiguous prophecy had been spoken, and a new, heavier silence had fallen between the father and the son. They had arrived at the place of which God had told him. This was no longer an abstract destination on a 3-day journey. It was a physical, tangible reality. It was a specific patch of rock and earth on the summit of a lonely mountain, a place that was about to be transformed by an act of terrible significance from a simple piece of geography into a sacred and blood-soaked altar. The time for walking, for thinking, for speaking was done. The time for the methodical, chilling, and irreversible mechanics of the sacrifice had begun. The narrative of Genesis, which had been a psychological drama of hidden torment, now becomes a cold, procedural account of a ritual murder in progress, and every simple, physical action is laden with a weight of almost unbearable horror. The first act in this terrible liturgy is one of construction. The text states, "Abraham built the altar there." This was a familiar task for a patriarch of his time. He had built altars before, at Shechem, at Bethel, at Hebron. An altar was a place of communion, a bridge between the human and the divine, a place to offer thanks and praise. But this altar was different. This was not an altar of communion. It was an altar of termination. It was not a bridge, but a wall, the final, terrible barrier that would forever separate him from his own son. Imagine the physical process. Abraham, an old man, his body filled with the strange, cold energy of a terrible purpose, begins to gather stones. Each stone he lifts from the ground is heavy, not just with its own physical weight, but with the weight of his intention. He is not just building a structure, he is building the stage for the final act. He would have to find stones that were flat enough, stable enough to create a solid platform. He would work with a methodical, almost robotic efficiency, his mind likely shutting down all other thoughts, focusing only on the immediate physical task. To think about the why would be to collapse. He could only focus on the how. He would place one stone upon another, his hands, the same hands that had held his infant son, now constructing his deathbed. The structure would have been simple, crude, a low, flat pile of rocks, perhaps a cubit high, just large enough to hold the body of a young man and the wood that would consume him. For Isaac, standing by in a state of likely confused and growing dread, the sight of his father, the great patriarch, silently and single-mindedly building this altar in the middle of nowhere, with no animal in sight, must have been a profoundly unsettling spectacle. The purpose of the altar was obvious, but the identity of the sacrifice was a terrifying, unspoken question mark that hung in the thin mountain air. Once the altar was built, the next step was to prepare the fuel, and he laid the wood in order. This, again, is an act of chilling procedural calmness. He takes the wood, the very same wood that his son Isaac had dutifully carried up the mountain on his own back, and he begins to arrange it carefully on top of the stone altar. He would have to create a stable, well-ventilated pyre, a structure designed for an efficient and total immolation. He would place the larger pieces first, creating a foundation, then crisscross the smaller pieces on top, creating a lattice that would hold the offering and allow the air to feed the flames. Every piece of wood he placed was a piece of the puzzle falling into place, another step from which there was no retreat. The son had carried the instrument of his own cremation, and now the father was arranging it, preparing it for the flame. The terrible, unwitting collaboration between father and son was now complete. The stage was fully set. The fire and the knife were in the father's hand. The wood was on the altar. The only remaining component was the lamb. And it is at this moment, with the altar built and the wood arranged, that the narrative turns from the inanimate to the animate, from the preparation of the stage to the preparation of the victim. The long, agonizing silence is broken by the father's will, a will that now must be translated into physical, violent action against his own child. The text delivers the central, horrifying act with a brevity that is almost journalistic in its coldness, a sparseness that forces the reader's imagination to fill in the terrible details. He bound Isaac, his son. This is the Akedah, the binding, the name by which this entire story is known in Jewish tradition. The word itself, derived from the Hebrew verb akad, is a specific term used for the binding of an animal's legs for sacrifice. Its use here is deliberate and devastating. In this single word, Isaac is transformed. He is no longer a son, no longer a person. He has been recategorized. He is now, in the chillingly detached language of the ritual, the offering, the sacrificial animal. We must pause and try to imagine the sheer physical and psychological horror of this moment. Abraham, the father, must now turn to Isaac, the son, and a silent, terrible struggle must ensue. Isaac, who had been a curious but perhaps compliant participant, now understands. The lamb is him. His father, his protector, the source of his life, is about to kill him. What is his reaction? The Bible, in one of its most profound and terrifying silences, tells us nothing. It erases the victim's voice, the victim's struggle, from the narrative entirely. We are not told if Isaac screamed, if he wept, if he pleaded for his life. We are not told if he fought back, if his young, strong body resisted the old, frail arms of his father. We are not told if, in an act of ultimate, incomprehensible piety that later rabbinic traditions would invent, he submitted willingly, stretching out his neck for the knife as a true and perfect sacrifice. The text's silence on this point is the true abyss of the story. It forces us to confront the spectrum of horrifying possibilities. Imagine the scene if Isaac struggled. Abraham, the 100-year-old man, would have had to physically overpower a strong, terrified youth. He would have had to wrestle his own son into submission, ignoring his pleas and his cries, his mind locked on the divine command with a terrifying, single-minded focus. It would be a scene of pathetic, grunting, familial violence, a grotesque parody of a father-son embrace, ending with the father tying the ropes around the wrists and ankles of his own child. Or imagine the scene if Isaac submitted. This, in many ways, is even more psychologically horrifying. It implies a conversation that the text mercifully spares us, a moment where the father must explain the inexplicable to his son, where the son, in a state of shock and terror, is somehow persuaded that his own murder at his father's hand is the will of a just and loving God. It is a scene of the most profound psychological abuse, the complete and total annihilation of a child's trust in the fundamental order of the world. Whether by force or by a terrifying, coerced submission, the act is accomplished. Abraham takes the ropes he has brought and binds his son's hands and feet. He is now holding his own child, trussed and helpless like a sheep for the slaughter. The next action is the culmination of this dehumanizing process. And he laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. He lifts his son, the child of the promise, and places his body upon the pyre he has built, the pyre that Isaac himself helped to transport. Isaac is no longer a person. He has become a part of the sacrificial arrangement, a piece of flesh to be offered. He is lying on his back, bound, looking up at the sky, or at the grim, tear-streaked or terrifyingly placid face of his own father looming over him. He can feel the hard, rough wood beneath his back. He can smell the dry scent of the kindling that is meant to consume him. Abraham has now done everything the command required except for the final, irreversible act. He has built the altar, he has arranged the wood, he has bound the victim, he has placed him upon the altar. There is no more preparation, there is no more delay, there is only the final, terrible consummation. The text describes this final moment with a slow, deliberate, almost cinematic focus. Then Abraham reached out his hand. This is the moment of ultimate willed commitment. He is no longer just an unwilling participant in a divine drama. His own body, his own hand, is now reaching out to become the instrument of the divine will. It is the point of no return. And took the knife. He grasps the handle of the ma'akalet, the great heavy knife he had carried in his other hand all the way up the mountain. The cold weight of it in his palm is the weight of his son's life. The glint of the sun on its sharpened edge is the last thing his son may ever see. The knife, an object of utility for the slaughter of animals, is now transformed into an object of ultimate theological and moral horror. It is the physical manifestation of Abraham's faith, a faith that is expressed not through love or mercy, but through a willingness to kill, to slaughter his son. The Hebrew verb, lishchot, is a brutal one. It is the standard, technical term for the ritual slaughter of a sacrificial animal, the cutting of the throat. The text is unflinching in its description of Abraham's intent. He is not just going to kill him, he is going to slaughter him, to offer him up in the precise, ritualized manner of a burnt offering. The hand is reached out, the knife is taken, the intent is absolute. The will of the Father and the will of God have become one single, murderous vector. The arm is raised, the blade is poised over the exposed throat of the bound and helpless boy on the altar. The story has been stripped of all theological abstraction, all philosophical debate. It has been reduced to this single, terrible, and unforgettable image. A father, his face a mask of terrible faith, about to bring a knife down into the flesh of his own child. This is the zenith of the test. It is the absolute, rock-bottom, 0 point of human morality, a place where faith and murder have become indistinguishable. And it is in this unbearable, timeless moment, with the knife in the air, that the entire narrative hangs, suspended between an act of monstrous obedience and the possibility of a grace that is, as yet, unrevealed. The knife was in the air. The physical world, in this final, terrible moment on the summit of Mount Moriah, had ceased to exist for Abraham. The distant mountains, the vast, empty sky, the feel of the rough stone of the altar under his knees, all of it would have dissolved into an irrelevant periphery. His entire universe, his entire consciousness, had contracted to a single, horrifying focal point. The glint of sun on the sharpened edge of the blade, the straining ropes that bit into the flesh of his son, and the pulse that he could likely see beating in the exposed, vulnerable neck of the boy he loved. The hand of the father, a hand that had once held this child in a tender, loving embrace, was now a mere extension of a will that was no longer his own. It was an instrument, a consecrated weapon, empowered by a faith so absolute, so terrible, that it had transcended every known law of human love and morality. The arm was raised, the final muscles tensed for the downward stroke. In this single, frozen, timeless instant, the entire, magnificent, star-strewn promise of the covenant was balanced on the razor's edge of this sacrificial knife. The story has been building to this unbearable, almost pornographic climax of piety. This is the moment of ultimate surrender, the act of holy filicide that will be the final, irrefutable proof of Abraham's devotion. He has successfully passed through every preceding stage of the test. He has obeyed the monstrous, world-negating command without a word of protest. He has endured the silent 3-day march into the heart of his own grief. He has withstood the innocent, soul-shattering questions of his own beloved child on the path. He has performed with a chilling and methodical calmness the horrific, intimate mechanics of the binding. He has proven himself not just willing, but actively capable. He has become the perfect, unthinking, and terrifying instrument of the divine will. In this moment, he is no longer a father, he is a force of nature, a hand moving to complete a sacred and terrible circuit. And it is in this final, irreversible nanosecond, the moment before the blade would have broken the skin and released the lifeblood of the covenant, that the profound, terrifying silence of heaven is finally, violently broken. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." The call is not a gentle whisper or a subtle nudge. It is a sharp, urgent, and commanding cry, a sound that rips through the tense stillness of the mountaintop. The repetition of his name, Abraham, Abraham, is a linguistic emergency brake. It is a cry designed to awaken him, to snap him out of the terrible, obedient, homicidal trance he has so successfully entered. It is a divine alarm bell, pulled at the last possible fraction of a second, a testament to just how far God was willing to let this test proceed. The voice, identified as the Malach Yahweh, the angel of the Lord, often understood in the Pentateuch as a direct physical manifestation or mouthpiece of God himself, is the voice of immediate and absolute authority. Abraham's response is instantaneous, the conditioned reflex of a servant who has been waiting, perhaps on some deep, unconscious level, for a new and contradictory order. And he said, "Here I am." It is the third and final time he utters this phrase in the story. The first was to God in the darkness of his tent, a declaration of his total readiness to receive the terrible command. The second was to his son on the mountain path, a deceptive, heartbreaking mask of paternal presence and availability. This third, "Here I am," is the response of a man being pulled back from the brink of an abyss, his attention instantly and completely shifting from the human victim on the altar to the divine voice from the sky. He is still the perfect servant, ready for the next instruction, even if that instruction is the complete and total negation of the one that has brought him to this horrific precipice. His obedience is absolute, regardless of the direction in which it is pointed. The angel's next words are a command of immediate and total cessation, a frantic, life-saving counterorder. Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. The prohibition is absolute and unequivocal. The test is over. The violence is to be stopped. The hand is to be frozen. The knife is to be lowered. The body of the boy is to remain untouched. The boundary between life and death, which had been all but erased, is suddenly and forcefully redrawn. But this life-saving reprieve is immediately followed by the divine explanation, the official, chilling, theological justification for the entire monstrous ordeal. The angel, speaking for God, declares, "For now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." This is the stated purpose of the test, the reason for the silent journey, the bound child, the raised knife. It was a demonstration, it was a proof, it was for God's benefit. Now I know. The Hebrew word for fear used here, yareh, is a rich and complex one. It does not simply mean to be afraid in a craven sense. It implies a profound sense of awe, of reverence, of absolute submission to a power that is overwhelmingly and terrifyingly greater than oneself. It is the existential shudder one feels in the presence of the truly holy, a holiness that is both loving and capable of demanding the unthinkable. Abraham has proven that his fear of God is so total, so absolute, that it has the power to override every other love, every other loyalty, every other ethical and paternal instinct that defines a human being. He has proven, in the most graphic and visceral way possible, that he is willing to give back the most precious and miraculous gift he has ever received. He has not withheld his son. This verb choice is chillingly transactional. It frames Isaac as a possession, an asset that Abraham was willing to relinquish to God upon demand. The test, from the divine perspective, has been a spectacular and unqualified success. God wanted to know, in a definitive and performative way, if Abraham loved and feared him more than anything else in the world, and Abraham has just provided a terrifying and irrefutable affirmative answer. He passed. But from any human perspective, this justification is profoundly and deeply troubling. What kind of God needs such a monstrous and traumatic demonstration of loyalty? An omniscient God, a God who knows the end from the beginning, who can search the depths of the human heart, should have already known the quality and extent of Abraham's faith. The story presents a God who seems to require empirical, observable evidence of devotion. It is a God who needs to see the knife in the air, to see the Father's hand raised against the Son before he can be truly, finally certain of his servant's ultimate allegiance. It paints a picture of a deity who is not above a form of divine, high-stakes behavioral psychology, a God who places his most beloved subject in an extreme, ethically impossible stress test situation simply to observe and record the outcome. The test, in this light, seems designed not for Abraham's benefit. It has brought him nothing but 3 days of unimaginable agony and a lifetime of trauma. It seems designed entirely for God's satisfaction. It is to satisfy a divine need to know, to have Abraham's ultimate fear and loyalty performed and proven in the physical world in real time. The horror of this is inescapable. It frames the entire story not as a necessary lesson for the betterment of humanity, but as a kind of divine vivisection of a single human soul. Abraham's heart has been laid bare, his most sacred paternal love has been used as a tool of interrogation, and his capacity for obedience has been pushed to the very brink of the monstrous, all to provide a satisfactory data point for a divine observer. The overwhelming relief of the last-second reprieve is forever tainted by the terrifying and inscrutable nature of the God who demanded such a test in the first place. The voice from heaven saves the boy, but it does not and cannot erase the horror of the command that initiated and justified the entire ordeal. Theodicy, the justification of God's goodness, shatters on the rocks of Mount Moriah. The immediate aftermath of this divine intervention is a moment of profound, surreal, and dizzying release for Abraham. He lowers the knife, he steps back from the altar, and the text says, "And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns." The miraculous has appeared. Just as Abraham had cryptically and perhaps desperately prophesied to his son on the path, God will provide for himself the lamb. God has indeed provided. The ram is the deus ex machina, the divine solution to the impossible theological problem that God himself had created. It is the substitute, the ransom, the creature whose life will now be forfeit so that the boys may be spared. "Because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." This is a complete and total reaffirmation of the original covenant, now repeated and amplified with an even greater intensity. The promise of descendants, which had been placed in mortal jeopardy on the altar, is now restored and made absolute. The blessing is unconditional. It is a reward for the fear of God that Abraham has just so terrifyingly demonstrated. His willingness to sacrifice everything has resulted in his receiving everything back, now with an unbreakable divine guarantee. The test, it seems, was a necessary gateway through which Abraham had to pass in order to secure the promise for all time. The logic is circular and terrifying. God threatens to destroy the promise in order to test Abraham's faith in the promise. And when Abraham passes the test by being willing to destroy the promise himself, God restores the promise with an even greater force. From a theological perspective, this is the triumphant climax of Abraham's spiritual journey. He has been weighed in the balance and has not been found wanting. He has become the father of faith, the ultimate paradigm of human obedience to the divine will. He has secured the future for his descendants. But from a human perspective, the scene is still deeply unsettling. The divine blessing does not erase the trauma. The promise of 1 million future children does not negate the reality of the one child who was just bound and laid upon a pyre. The oath from heaven is a reward, but it is a reward for an act that, by any human ethical standard, was monstrous. The story concludes with God and Abraham seemingly reconciled and their covenant stronger than ever. But the price of this strengthened relationship was a journey into the darkest corner of the human soul, a place where faith and filicide became one and the same. The ransom in the thicket saved the life of the boy, but it could not ransom the father or the son from the memory of the knife. The smoke from the ram's sacrifice had drifted away into the vast, indifferent sky. The divine oath, a torrent of renewed and amplified promises, had echoed from the heavens and then fallen silent. The test was over. The terrible ordeal on Mount Moriah had reached its formal conclusion, a conclusion that the narrative, with its triumphant angelic speeches and its faith-affirming naming of the place, frames as a victory. It is presented as the ultimate story of faith tested and faith rewarded, the story of a man whose absolute, terrifying obedience earned him and his descendants an eternal blessing. This is the traditional, reassuring reading, the one that has been preached from pulpits for millennia. It is a story with a neat and tidy ending. The boy is saved, the father is vindicated, the covenant is secured, and God is pleased. But a closer, more careful, and more psychologically honest reading of the final sparse verses of Genesis 22 and the chapters that immediately follow reveals a far more unsettling, fragmented, and tragic truth. The event on the mountain was not a clean, victorious episode with a happy ending that could be neatly packaged into a moral lesson. It was a trauma. It was a profound, soul-shattering wound inflicted upon the heart of a family, a wound so deep that its scars would alter the course of their lives forever. The narrative, in its subtle but powerful omissions, its jarring juxtapositions, and its deafening silences, suggests that the horror of the Akedah was not resolved on the mountaintop. In fact, the true and lasting consequences of Abraham's test were only just beginning to unfold. The story does not end with a joyous, united family walking down the mountain together, their faith strengthened by their shared ordeal. It ends with a quiet, fractured, and lonely descent, a descent that suggests the true cost of Abraham's obedience was the very family the promise was meant to build. The first and most jarring of these silences, a textual gap that has been the source of immense speculation and anxiety for commentators for centuries, occurs in the single verse that describes the journey down from the mountain. After the sacrifice, after the naming of the place, after the second angelic oracle, the text tells us, "So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba." Read that sentence again, slowly, and then read it again, and notice, with a growing sense of dread, who is completely, utterly, and terrifyingly absent. Abraham returned to his young men. There is no mention of Isaac, the boy who had been the central focus of the entire harrowing narrative, the silent victim on the altar, the reason for the entire test, simply vanishes from the scene. The text does not say, Abraham and Isaac returned to the young men. It does not say, the father and the son went down the mountain together. It says with a cold and brutal precision that Abraham returned, alone. This is not a minor oversight. In the tightly economical and deliberate prose of the Hebrew Bible, every word matters and every absence speaks volumes. This specific, glaring omission of Isaac from the descent narrative is a narrative choice of profound and chilling significance. It is a deliberate act of textual separation. Where did Isaac go? What happened to the boy after his father unbound him from the altar, after he had watched a ram be slaughtered and burned in his place, after he had heard the voice of an angel declare that his near murder was a successful test of his father's fear of God? This silence is the true abyss of the story's aftermath. It is a black hole of unresolved trauma, and it forces us to confront a spectrum of horrifying possibilities for what happened in those first, unrecorded moments after the divine intervention. Did they, in fact, walk down the mountain together, their physical proximity now a mockery of the infinite emotional distance that had opened up between them? Did they walk in a silence born of shock and shame, a silence so profound that the narrator, in a moment of profound authorial empathy, simply could not bring himself to describe it? Was their shared experience a silent, unbreakable, but now terrifying and toxic bond? This is the most benign, yet still deeply tragic possibility. It suggests a relationship that is not severed, but is now permanently defined by an unspeakable shared memory, a love forever tainted by the glint of the knife. Or did Abraham, overwhelmed by a mixture of his own shame, his own relief, and his own terrifying piety, send his son on ahead? Did he find himself unable to look his child in the eye, unable to find the words to bridge the chasm that had opened between them? "Go on ahead, my son. I will follow." It would be the act of a man so broken by what he has done that he can no longer bear the presence of his own victim, a man who needs to be alone with his God to process the terrible communion he has just experienced. Or, in a more radical and psychologically devastating reading, did they separate by Isaac's choice? Did Isaac, as soon as the ropes were cut from his wrists, scramble away from the father who had just been prepared to butcher him? Did he, in a state of profound shock and terror, refuse to walk another step with the man who had been his protector and had become his executioner? Did he flee down a different path, seeking solace not with his father, but perhaps trying to find his own way back to his mother, Sarah, the one parent who had not been a part of this terrifying and incomprehensible ordeal? This interpretation sees the silence not as a narrative choice, but as a reflection of a real physical separation, a son running for his life, not from a wild beast, but from the terrible, righteous love of his own father. The text does not give us an answer, and this ambiguity is precisely the point. The story, which had so tightly and repeatedly bound the father and son together in its terrible narrative refrain, "So they went, both of them together," now quietly, surgically, and permanently severs them. Their unity is broken. Whatever happened on that mountain, it shattered the simple, trusting, and foundational bond between a father and his son. They went up the mountain together as a single unit defined by paternal love and filial obedience. But they did not come down together. The shared experience did not unite them in a stronger faith. It seems to have permanently and irrevocably alienated them. Isaac, the boy whose name means laughter, has been silenced by a trauma so profound that he is literally erased from the narrative of its immediate aftermath. He is no longer a character with a voice. He has become a ghost, a traumatized survivor who disappears from his own story at the very moment of his salvation. This deafening silence surrounding Isaac is immediately compounded by the narrative's next jarring and seemingly disconnected move. The very next chapter, Genesis 23, begins with a stark and mournful announcement. Sarah's life was 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. And Sarah died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan, and Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. The juxtaposition is brutal and deliberate. The story of the near sacrifice of the beloved son is immediately followed by the story of the actual death of the beloved mother. The text, once again, draws no explicit causal link between the two events. But the narrative proximity is so powerful, so suggestive, that it is almost impossible for a careful reader not to see a deep and tragic connection. Jewish midrashic traditions, those powerful and imaginative attempts by later rabbis to fill in the Bible's narrative gaps and explore its psychological depths, have created a host of powerful and tragic stories to explain Sarah's death. They refuse to accept it as a coincidence. In one of the most famous and enduring of these traditions, the agent of her death is Satan himself. Having failed in his ultimate attempt to tempt Abraham into disobedience on the mountain, the adversary, in a final act of malicious spite, goes to Sarah, who has been waiting at home in Beersheba, consumed with anxiety. He appears to her, perhaps in the guise of a weary traveler returning from Moriah. He begins by telling her a version of the truth. He describes the scene on the mountain in vivid, horrifying detail: the altar of cold stones, the carefully arranged wood, the terrible binding of her beloved, miraculous son, the father's raised hand holding the gleaming knife. Sarah, overwhelmed by the sheer horror of this vision, a grief and a terror too great for a human heart to bear, lets out a great cry, and her soul departs from her body. She dies of a broken heart, murdered by the story of what her husband was willing to do. In another, even more psychologically cruel version of the tale, her death is caused not by grief, but by a whiplash of emotion. Satan first comes to her and tells her the terrible news, and she collapses in a state of near death. He then returns, and, seeing his work is not yet complete, he tells her a different truth: that at the last moment, an angel called from heaven, the boy was spared, and a ram was sacrificed in his place. The sudden, violent surge of emotion from the absolute abyss of despair to the ecstatic heights of relief is too much for her aged body and her tormented heart to withstand. She dies of a false and fatal joy. While these are extra-biblical traditions, they speak to a deep, intuitive, and correct understanding of the story's unspoken psychological horror. Sarah, the woman who had waited 90 years for her child, the woman who had laughed in cynical disbelief at the promise of his birth and then laughed with pure joy at his fulfillment, is completely, utterly, and chillingly absent from the narrative of the Akedah. She is not consulted about the sacrifice of her only child. She is not informed of the terrible journey. Her voice, which had been so powerful in the episode of Hagar and Ishmael, is now silent. The two most important men in her life, her husband and her son, go off on a secret 3-day journey to a distant mountain, and one of them is nearly ritually murdered by the other in the name of a secret, divine command. How could she not have been a casualty of this event? The story, by placing her death immediately and without comment after the events on Moriah, implicitly frames her as the final, indirect victim of Abraham's test. The knife that was aimed at Isaac's throat seems to have found its way, metaphorically, into the heart of his mother. The perfect faith of the father has led to the death of the mother. The family unit, which had been the central focus of the entire Abrahamic narrative, the very vessel through which the divine covenant was to be transmitted, is now shattered. The son is silenced, traumatized, and textually absent. The mother is dead, and Abraham is left to mourn, a lonely and isolated patriarch whose greatest act of faith has cost him the very domestic peace and familial wholeness he had waited a lifetime to achieve. He has proven his absolute fear of God, but in doing so, he has seemingly destroyed his family. He is the father of faith, but he is now a widower with a deeply traumatized son from whom he seems to be estranged. The triumphant theological victory on the mountain is immediately followed by a profound and tragic human defeat in the tent. And what of Isaac? When he finally reappears in the narrative, it is not as the laughing, vibrant boy of his youth, but as a quiet, passive, and strangely melancholic figure. We see him next in Genesis 24, a chapter dedicated entirely to the quest for a wife for him. But it is a quest in which he plays no active part. Abraham, now a very old man, summons his chief servant and makes him swear a solemn oath. The servant is to travel back to Abraham's homeland in Mesopotamia and find a wife for Isaac from among their own kindred. Abraham will not allow his son to marry one of the local Canaanite women. The entire, elaborate process of finding this bride, the servant's long journey, his prayer at the well for a divine sign, the fateful and divinely orchestrated meeting with the beautiful and generous Rebekah, the negotiations with her family, is all orchestrated by the father and his proxy. Isaac is the passive object of the entire story, not its active subject. He is a piece on his father's chessboard, being moved into position for the continuation of the covenant. Our first glimpse of him as a young adult is when the servants' caravan with Rebekah is returning to the camp. We are told that Isaac had gone out to meditate in the field at the eventide. The Hebrew word used here for meditate, laswach, is a rare and unusual one. It does not suggest peaceful contemplation. It carries with it a sense of deep, sorrowful, and perhaps troubled reflection, a kind of mournful communing with his own thoughts. The image is one of profound loneliness, a young man walking by himself in the fields as the sun goes down, a portrait of quiet, persistent melancholy. This is what has become of the child of laughter. He sees the camels approaching. He is told that the beautiful woman is his intended bride, and he brings her into his mother Sarah's tent. The text then delivers a line that is a masterpiece of psychological insight and understated tragedy. And he took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. So Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. This single sentence is a window into the soul of the silent son. It tells us that for all the years that have passed since the death of Sarah, a death that was inextricably linked to the trauma of Moriah, Isaac has been living in a state of unresolved grief and comfortlessness. His marriage to Rebekah is not presented primarily as a joyous, romantic union, but as a form of therapy. The love he develops for his new wife serves as a comfort, a solace, for the profound and lingering wound left by the loss of his mother. The trauma of Moriah and the subsequent death of his mother have shaped him into a quiet, pensive, and sorrowful man. The laughter that his name signified has been permanently and irrevocably silenced on the altar. The boy who went up the mountain full of innocent, logical questions came down a man burdened by a terrible, irrational knowledge, a man who had looked into the abyss of absolute faith and seen his own father staring back. He is the first, and perhaps the greatest, of the Bible's many traumatized survivors, his entire subsequent life colored by an event in which he was the silent, bound victim. The relationship between Abraham and Isaac is never again depicted with any of the warmth or intimacy that must have preceded the journey to Moriah. They are never again shown in a moment of tender father-son dialogue. They coexist in the narrative, but they do not seem to connect. The text, in its final summary of Abraham's long life, tells us that he remarried, had more children with his new wife Keturah, lived to a ripe old age of 175, and gave all that he had to Isaac. The inheritance is secured, the legal obligation is fulfilled. At his death, the text says that his sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah. The brief, almost business-like reunion of the two estranged brothers, the son of the promise and the son of the flesh, the one who was almost sacrificed and the one who was cast out, to bury their powerful, complicated father, is the final, poignant image of this fractured family. The easy, loving bond that must have existed between Abraham and Isaac before the journey to Moriah is gone, replaced by a formal, distant, and perhaps duty-bound respect. The scars of Moriah, it seems, were not just on Isaac, they were on Abraham as well. While he is celebrated for all time as the father of faith, his life immediately after the test is one of loneliness and mourning. He has passed the test, he has secured the covenant, he has become the ultimate paradigm of human obedience to the divine will. But in the human terrestrial sphere, his victory is hollow. He has lost his wife, he has lost the trust and intimacy of his son. He is a man who has communed with God on a level few others ever have, but he has become a stranger in his own tent. The story, when read with an eye for its human cost, is not a simple parable about the virtues of obedience. It is a profound and tragic exploration of the devastating price of that obedience. It is a story that asks a deeply unsettling question. What if a test from God, even one that is passed and divinely rewarded, leaves the victor so wounded, so broken, so utterly alone, that the victory itself feels indistinguishable from a catastrophic defeat? The final, unsettling detail is in the naming of the place. Abraham calls the mountain Yahweh Yireh, the Lord will provide. This is his heroic attempt to cast the story in a positive light, to make it a story of divine provision and grace. But the text immediately adds a strange folkloric note. As it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. This suggests that the place became a famous landmark, a site of pilgrimage, a place where the story was told and retold. But what was remembered there? Was it the miraculous provision of the ram or the horrifying binding of the boy? The name attempts to memorialize the grace of the ending, but it cannot erase the deep foundational horror of the beginning and the middle. The scars of Moriah are not just on the psyche of the family of Abraham, they are etched into the landscape itself, a permanent geographical reminder of a place where a father's faith and a son's life were placed on a terrible, sacrificial balance. The reprieve came, but the memory of the raised knife, the silence of the boy on the altar, and the fractured, lonely descent from the mountain would linger forever, a testament to the fact that even when a wound is divinely healed, the scar remains as a permanent and terrifying record of the pain. The lonely figures descend from the mountain, not together but apart, leaving behind them an altar stained with the blood of a ram and a silence thick with the memory of what almost was. The story of the binding of Isaac, the Akedah, concludes in the biblical text with this quiet, fractured whimper, a portrait of a family saved but shattered. And yet, in the history of human thought, this is not an ending. It is a beginning. For this single, terrifying story, this brief and brutal narrative of a divine test and a near filicide, would refuse to remain a quiet, tragic family tale. It would escape the confines of its own text and begin a new, powerful, and often controversial life in the memory of civilizations. The echo of Abraham's knife, the silent cry of the bound boy on the altar, would resonate through the centuries, becoming a foundational myth, a cornerstone of theology, and a source of profound inspiration and existential horror for three of the world's great religions, and for the secular philosophers who would later grapple with their legacy. The story's true and enduring power lies not just in what it says, but in what it has been made to mean. Its legacy is a testament to the human capacity to find faith, meaning, and even beauty in an event that, on its surface, is one of the most morally terrifying stories ever told. For Judaism, the tradition that first received and preserved this narrative, the story of the Akedah, is perhaps the single most important and defining moment in its relationship with God. It is not remembered primarily as a story of trauma, but as the ultimate, triumphant story of faith, emunah, and the foundational act of Jewish identity. In rabbinic thought, Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son became the supreme example of perfect, unwavering obedience to God's will, no matter how inscrutable or painful. It is seen as the final and greatest of 10 tests that God gave to Abraham to prove his worthiness as the patriarch of the chosen people. By passing this ultimate test, Abraham did not just save his son, he created a vast reservoir of merit, a spiritual inheritance for all of his descendants. The merit of the Akedah is seen as a kind of spiritual treasury from which the Jewish people can draw in times of need, a plea for mercy based on the perfect faith of their ancestor. When Jews in later generations would pray for deliverance, they would often invoke the memory of the Akedah, reminding God of the absolute devotion shown by Abraham, a devotion that should, in turn, merit a compassionate response. Jewish tradition, in a fascinating and powerful move, also profoundly reinterpreted the character of Isaac. The Bible's silent, passive victim is transformed in many midrashic accounts into a willing and even enthusiastic participant in his own sacrifice. In these retellings, Isaac is not a frightened boy, but a mature man of 37. When Abraham reveals the divine command to him, Isaac does not resist. Instead, he embraces his fate as a holy martyr. He asks his father to bind him tightly, lest he flinch at the sight of the knife and spoil the perfection of the sacrifice. He becomes a co-conspirator with his father in this act of absolute faith, a willing offering who is as committed to the divine will as the man holding the knife. This reinterpretation solves the profound ethical problem of the story by removing the element of coercion. It ceases to be the story of a father imposing a terrible will upon his son, and becomes the story of a father and son walking together in a shared, perfect submission to God. The horror of the filicide is transformed into the glory of a double martyrdom, averted at the final moment. The Akedah, in this light, is not a story of divine cruelty, but the story of the birth of Jewish martyrdom, the willingness to sacrifice everything for God. For Christianity, the story of the Akedah was absorbed and reinterpreted through a new and powerful theological lens, the life and death of Jesus Christ. From the earliest days of the Church, Christian theologians saw the binding of Isaac not just as a story about Abraham's faith, but as a type, a prophetic prefiguration, a divinely orchestrated dress rehearsal for the central event of their own faith, the crucifixion. The parallels they drew were numerous and specific. Abraham, the loving father, willing to sacrifice his beloved, only son, became a type of God the Father, who would, in the fullness of time, sacrifice his only begotten son for the salvation of the world. The language of the command, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love," was seen as a direct prophecy of the language the Gospel of John would use to describe Jesus. Isaac, in this Christian reading, became a type of Christ. He was the miracle child, the son of the promise. His submission to his father, particularly in the Jewish traditions that the early Christians inherited, was seen as a prefiguration of Christ's own willing submission to the will of the Father in the Garden of Gethsemane. "Not my will, but thine, be done." The most powerful parallel was the image of Isaac carrying the wood for his own sacrifice up the mountain. For Christian interpreters, this was an unmistakable prophecy of Jesus carrying his own wooden cross up the hill of Golgotha. The journey to Moriah became the journey to Calvary. The fact that the story takes place on a mountain in the land of Moriah, the very same mountain range where Jerusalem and the Temple Mount would later be located, was seen as a divine masterstroke of geographical prophecy. The ram caught in the thicket also took on a new, profound meaning. It was the substitute that died in Isaac's place. For Christians, this was a perfect allegory for the concept of substitutionary atonement. The ram, an innocent victim, dies to save the son of the promise. In the same way, they argued, Jesus, the innocent Lamb of God, would die on the cross as a substitute for sinful humanity, his death paying the price that others deserved. The Akedah, in this powerful and influential rereading, was no longer primarily a story about a test of Abraham's faith. It became a key piece of evidence in a grand salvation historical narrative, a shadow of a greater, more perfect sacrifice to come. The horror of the event was softened and recontextualized. It was not a story about a near murder. It was the first faint prophetic glimmer of the gospel. The story also holds a place of central importance in Islam, though with some significant differences. The Quran tells the story of the patriarch Abraham, and his willingness to sacrifice his son in a dream vision from Allah. The core theme is the same: absolute and total submission, Islam, to the will of God, no matter how painful or incomprehensible. The story is a foundational narrative of what it means to be a Muslim, one who submits. However, a key difference in most Islamic traditions is the identity of the son. While the Quran does not explicitly name the son who was to be sacrificed, the majority of Islamic scholars identify him not as Isaac, Ishaq, but as Abraham's firstborn son, Ishmael, Ismail. This shift has profound theological implications. By making Ishmael, the ancestor of the Arab peoples, the central figure in this ultimate act of submission, the story is recentered in an Arabian context, providing a powerful spiritual lineage for the Prophet Muhammad and the religion of Islam. The annual Muslim festival of Eid al-Adha, the Feast of the Sacrifice, directly commemorates Ibrahim's willingness to sacrifice his son. During this festival, Muslims around the world ritually slaughter an animal, typically a sheep or a goat, to honor Ibrahim's obedience and to symbolize their own submission to God. The act on Mount Moriah is thus not just a story to be read, it is a ritual to be reenacted, a foundational event that is brought into the present day through a communal act of sacrifice. In all three Abrahamic faiths, then, this terrifying story of a father, a son, and a knife has been transformed from a source of potential horror into a cornerstone of religious identity, a paradigm of faith, prophecy, and submission. But it is outside of these faith traditions, in the world of secular philosophy, that the raw, unprocessed horror of the story has been most keenly felt and most deeply explored. For existentialist thinkers, particularly the 19th century Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, the story of the Akeda is not a comforting parable, but a terrifying and thrilling glimpse into the true, paradoxical nature of faith. In his brilliant and deeply personal book, Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard uses the story of Abraham to explore what he calls the teleological suspension of the ethical. Kierkegaard argues that the ethical, the realm of universal moral laws, e.g., thou shalt not kill, a father must protect his son, is the highest plane of existence for a normal human being. But faith, true faith, requires a leap into a higher, paradoxical realm, the religious. In this realm, the individual has a direct, personal, and absolute relationship with God that can sometimes require them to suspend their universal ethical duties for the sake of a higher divine command, a telos or purpose. Abraham, for Kierkegaard, is the knight of faith. When he receives the command to kill Isaac, he is faced with an absolute choice. The ethical part of him knows that killing his son is the most monstrous and immoral act imaginable. But his faith demands that he obey the private, personal command of God, even if it makes him a murderer in the eyes of the world and in the light of his own reason. This act, this teleological suspension of the ethical, can never be understood or justified by reason or universal morality. It is, by its very nature, absurd. Abraham cannot explain himself to Sarah, to Isaac, or to his servants, because his actions are based on a private revelation that has no standing in the shared ethical world. He is utterly and completely alone, a man whose faith has isolated him from the rest of humanity. Kierkegaard is both terrified and exhilarated by this image. He sees Abraham not as a placid saint, but as a man in a state of constant fear and trembling, a man who has staked his entire existence on a paradox that he can never fully comprehend. For Kierkegaard, the story is not about providing a moral lesson. It is about showing that true faith is not a comfortable set of beliefs, but a terrifying, personal, and absurd leap into a relationship with the absolute that shatters all human categories of right and wrong. And so we are left, at the end of this long and terrible story, with the final, unavoidable question. What was the true nature of the evil on Mount Moriah? It was not the evil of a pagan god demanding a human sacrifice. The evil is far more subtle and far more profound. It is the evil of a command that is presented as both loving and murderous, a command that forces its recipient into a choice between two forms of annihilation, the annihilation of his own child, or the annihilation of his relationship with his God. It is the evil of a test that seems designed to break the human spirit, to prove that a man's fear of God can be made to be stronger than a father's love for his son. It is the evil of a story that can be and has been used to justify the suspension of all human ethics in the name of a higher, divine command. It suggests that the ultimate act of faith may be indistinguishable from the ultimate act of monstrosity. The story of Abraham and Isaac is not a simple parable with a clear moral. It is a dark and complex poem about the terrifying nature of absolute faith. It is a story that does not provide answers, but instead leaves us with a set of permanent, haunting questions. What is the nature of a God who would issue such a command? What is the nature of a man who would obey it? And what is the nature of a world in which the highest act of religious devotion can look so much like the most terrible of human crimes? The story of the Akeda, in the end, is a testament to the fact that the most profound horrors are often found not in the actions of the wicked, but in the terrible, righteous, and incomprehensible choices of the faithful. The knife on Moriah was lowered, but its echo has never ceased to resound, a permanent, terrifying reminder of a faith that can lead a man to the very edge of the abyss, and a God who will wait until the last possible second to call him back. We return from the mountain, from the thin, cold air of absolute faith, back to the familiar landscape of our own time. The story is over, but its terrible beauty and its profound horror remain. It is a story that acts as a knife itself, cutting away our easy assumptions about faith, obedience, and the nature of the divine. It leaves us, like Abraham, with a renewed promise, but also with a permanent and unsettling scar. It forces us to ask ourselves what we truly love, what we truly fear, and what we would be willing to place upon the altar if a voice called to us in the night. The fire on the mountain has been extinguished, but the questions it ignited continue to burn.